Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're jumping straight into something pretty fascinating. The intersection of natural language, how we talk, and programming languages, how we write code.
That's right. It's often called NLP-4P, natural language processing for programming.
Exactly. And this is for you if you're looking to quickly get a handle on key tech ideas, maybe find some surprising connections along the way.
And we've got some great material to dig into. There's a big survey from the ACL Anthology, which is basically a major hub for research in computational linguistics.
Okay.
Plus, some interesting articles about new AI tools that are trying to generate code directly from research papers.
Generate code from papers. Wow. Okay.
Yeah, it's a big leap. And we'll also look at, best practices in scientific computing, some real-world stuff about turning research into working code based on what developers and researchers are actually discussing.
So the goal is to pull out the core concepts for you, understand where things are and where they might be going without getting totally bogged down in, super technical detail.
Precisely. Keep it understandable but insightful.
Because this stuff matters.
Yeah.
Right? Whether you code yourself or you're a researcher using these tools, or honestly, even if you're just curious about AI's future, NLP-4P is a really important piece of the puzzle.
It really is. It's about how machines are learning to understand code, generate code. It impacts workflows, research, maybe even how we teach programming.
Should be some aha moments, hopefully.
Yeah.
So let's start at the beginning. What is NLP-4P, fundamentally?
Well, at its heart, it's about applying those NLP techniques, the ones we use for human language, and pointing them at programming languages instead.
Okay, makes sense.
And that ACL survey we mentioned, it highlights two really key properties of programming languages that NLP-4P focuses on.
All right, lay them on us. What are they?
So the first one is structure-based.
Right.
This is all about the syntax, the organization. Think indentation in Python, keywords, brackets, the grammar of the code.
Right, like how it looks and the rules it follows.
Yeah.
You gave the fib-in function example, the def, the indentation, the Eiffel statements.
Yeah.
That's structure.
Exactly. It's the visual and grammatical scaffolding.
Okay. And the second property?
The second is functionality-oriented. This is about what the code actually does. It's input-output behavior.
So for fib-n, the functionality is taking an integer n.
And producing the nth Fibonacci number as output.
Yeah.
It's the transformation it performs, what it achieves.
Got it. Structure, how it's built, functionality, what it does.
So how do NLP-4P tasks map onto these?
Good question. The survey groups them nicely. For structure-based tasks, mostly about understanding code, you have things like summarization.
Summarization, like writing comments automatically.
Exactly. Generating comments or doc strings to explain a piece of code. Imagine how useful that could be for developers facing a huge, unfamiliar code base.
Oh, absolutely. A total game changer for figuring things out quickly.
Right. Then there's retrieval or code search. Tools like SourceGraph use this. You type in plain English what you're looking for.
And it finds relevant code snippets.
Yep. Based on understanding your query and the code structure and maybe comments. And then there's classification.
Classification like sorting code.
Sort of. More like identifying types of code, finding duplicated code that's clone detection, or importantly, identifying potential security vulnerabilities by analyzing the code structure.
How does that work? How can it spot vulnerabilities just from structure?
Well, one powerful technique uses something called code property graphs, CPGs. Think of it as a really rich map of the code.
Okay.
It merges different views. The abstract syntax tree, which is like the grammatical structure.
Yeah.
The control flow graph, which shows how the program executes step by step. And the program dependence graph, showing how different parts rely on each other.
Wow. Okay. So it combines all those perspectives.
Exactly. It gives a very comprehensive picture for tasks like finding those tricky vulnerabilities.
Okay. That covers the understanding side, focusing on structure. What about the doing side? The functionality-oriented tasks.
Right. These are mostly about generating code. The big one is synthesis, program synthesis, creating code from scratch.
Often based on just a natural language description, maybe? Write a function that does X. Precisely. Then there's code completion. You see this all the time in IDEs, right? Suggesting the next bit of code as you type.
Yeah, like Copilot and tools like that. They're getting incredibly good.
They really are. And actually, the line between that kind of advanced code completion and full program synthesis is getting pretty blurry these days.
I can see that. Yeah. Sometimes feels like it's writing half the code for you.
It does. Other functionality tasks include transcription or program translation, converting code between different languages like Python to Java.
Oh, that could be useful.
Definitely. And finally, code refinement. taking existing code and improving it somehow, making it faster, or maybe just easier to read.
This whole field sounds incredibly active.
Yeah.
Now, deep learning, that always comes up. How has it impacted code generation specifically in NLP4P?
Oh, hugely. Deep learning has really driven the automation of code generation, especially in the last, say, 10 years.
What was the big breakthrough?
A major turning point was the transformer architecture. Around 2017, you hear about it everywhere now.
Right, for things like ChatGPT.
Exactly. Transformers enabled training these enormous models on vast data sets of code. And these models started to implicitly learn the patterns, the structure, the properties of code just from seeing so much of it.
So they weren't explicitly programmed with grammar rules, they just figured it out.
Largely, yes, which shifted the focus. Now, the trend is often less about designing totally new models from scratch and more about leveraging these massive, powerful, pre-trained models that already exist.
Building on the shoulders of giants, so to speak. The survey mentioned 3 stages of development.
Yeah, a kind of evolution. First was the exploratory stage. Researchers basically just took existing sequence-to-sequence models, the kind used for machine translation.
Like translating French to English.
Exactly, and they just threw code at them, treating it like another language. Translate English description to Python code.
How well did that work?
It was okay, a starting point, but code isn't just another language. So stage 2 involved more careful model design.
Getting more specific to code.
Right. Researchers started explicitly incorporating knowledge about programming languages like their tree structures, ASTs, or graph structures into the models. Techniques like SBT, structure-based traversal, or multi-way tree LSTMs came out of this phase.
Making the models more code-aware. Okay, and stage 3.
Stage 3 is the current era. Large, pre-trained models. These giants, trained on immense code bases, learn so much implicitly through self-supervised pre-training.
Self-supervised, meaning they learn from the code itself without explicit labels.
Correct. And interestingly, while they learn all this complex structure implicitly, the generation part often comes back to simpler sequential modeling, but underpinned by this incredibly rich learned knowledge.
That's fascinating. So do different tasks need different kinds of models or code representations? Is one approach better for structure versus functionality?
That's a great question. The survey suggests that for functionality tasks like generating code that just works the exact backbone model might be less critical. But for structure-based tasks, understanding code, finding clones, vulnerabilities, the way you represent the code and how well that matches your model matters more.
So how you feed the code into the model is key for understanding tasks.
Exactly. Older models like RNNs or LSTMs could handle sequences, like processing an AST by walking through its nodes in order. But flattening a tree into a sequence can, lose some information.
Right, you lose the hierarchy.
Precisely. That's where graph-based representations shine, those CPGs we talked about, or call graphs. They capture those complex relationships much better.
And that helps with things like finding vulnerabilities.
Yes, potentially big improvements there. And for code summarization, too. Newer work, like DeepSeek Coder, even looks at dependencies across whole files, not just within one function.
That makes sense. Code isn't usually isolated. What about the transformer models themselves? Are some better than others for code?
Well, models like GraphCodeBERT, Unix Coder, CodeT5, they're designed to incorporate structural info, data flow, AST node types, things like that.
And that generally helps.
Generally boosts performance across the board on NLP4P tasks, yes. The survey notes Unix Coder seems particularly strong on understanding tasks.
Like classification or search.
While CodeT5 often does very well on generation tasks.
Interesting. Different tools for different jobs again. Okay, so we have these models generating code. How do we know if it's any good? How do we measure success?
Right, evaluation. There are 2 main approaches, similarity-based metrics and execution-based metrics.
Similarity, like comparing it to human code.
Exactly. These often come straight from NLP. You compare the AI-generated code to a reference, a gold standard human-written version.
What was an example?
BLEU score is a common one. It looks at the overlap of n-grams short sequences of code tokens between the generated and reference code. High overlap suggests higher quality based on precision.
Okay, so how much does it look like the right answer? What's the other approach?
Execution-based metrics. This is more direct. You actually run the generated code.
You run it against test cases.
Yep. You have a set of test inputs and expected outputs. Does the generated code produce the correct output for those inputs? The metric is often just the pass rate, what percentage of tests it passes.
So does it actually work? That seems pretty crucial.
It really is. It measures functional correctness directly.
Okay, this is all fascinating. Now, you mentioned earlier these tools trying to generate code from research papers.
Mm-hmm.
Paper 2 code. Tell me more about that.
Yeah, Paper 2 Code, it's a really exciting idea. The name says it all, right?
Pretty much.
The goal is to automate that step of going from a published scientific paper, especially in fields like machine learning, directly to working code that implements the ideas in the paper.
Why is that so important?
Because often, papers get published without the code, or the code is hard to find, or doesn't quite match the paper.
Making it really hard to reproduce the results or build on them.
Exactly. It's a major bottleneck in science. Reproducibility is key. So tools that can bridge that gap automatically are potentially transformative. It's interesting, though, early attempts apparently struggled with the implicit knowledge.
Implicit knowledge.
Yeah, the stuff experienced researchers just assume the reader knows, which isn't explicitly spelled out in the paper. Machines aren't good at assumptions.
Ah, that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
A human reader fills in the gaps. How did these tools, like Papercoder you mentioned, how do they work?
Papercoder is described as a multi-agent LLM framework. It sounds complex, but think of it as having different AI agents specializing in different parts of the job.
Yeah, okay.
There's a planning agent that designs the overall structure, figures out file dependencies, maybe even draws diagrams. Then an analysis agent digs into the paper's text and math to pull out the specific implementation details.
Right, the core logic.
And finally, a generation agent actually writes the code, module by module, keeping those dependencies straight.
And does it work?
Early results seem quite promising. Reports suggest it can generate high-quality code that faithfully implements the paper's methods.
That's incredible. The potential to speed up science.
Yeah.
It's huge. Is the research community buzzing about this?
Oh, definitely. Lots of discussion on places like Hacker News, GitHub. People are really interested in how well these tools work and how they can be improved. There was even a follow-up project, someone called Paper 2 Code 2 Code.
Huh. That shows the enthusiasm.
It really does. It shows people are actively experimenting and building on these ideas.
But I imagine it's not perfect, right? Going from dense academic text to flawless code automatically, there must be challenges.
Absolutely. It's far from a solved problem.
Yeah.
Just understanding the paper thoroughly is the first big hurdle. You might need to read it multiple times, chase down citations.
Which can be tricky with paywalls sometimes.
Right. And then, crucially, paying super close attention to the data used in the original paper. If you re-implement the algorithm but test it on slightly different data, your results might not match, even if your code is correct.
The context matters just as much as the algorithm itself.
For sure. The core task often boils down to that careful translation. Math equations and model descriptions into actual code, choosing the right data structures.
It's not just copy-pasting formulas.
Not at all. And sometimes it's worth asking, is there a simpler way? Before diving into implementing a super complex model from a paper, maybe a simpler baseline exists.
Good point. Any other pitfalls?
Well, something maybe less obvious is software patents. You need to be aware if the algorithm you're implementing might be covered by one.
Right, the legal side. What about best practices for actually doing the implementation, assuming you decide to go ahead?
Several good ones came up in the sources. One is prototyping. Build a simpler version first, test it, make sure you understand the core ideas, then build the full, potentially more complex version. Helps catch errors early.
Makes sense. Iterate.
And document everything, especially for complex models. Write down your choices, your interpretations, any assumptions you made. Your future self or anyone else looking at the code will thank you.
Definitely. Documentation is key.
Talking it through with others who've read the paper is also really valuable. Get different perspectives, clarify confusing parts.
Collaboration helps. What about leveraging existing work?
Big one. In scientific computing, you rarely need to write everything from scratch. Use existing libraries. Don't reinvent the wheel for standard algorithms or data structures.
Stand on the shoulders of others.
Exactly. Plan for mistakes, too. That means verification and validation. How do you check your code is actually doing what the paper says? How do you test it?
Crucial for scientific rigor.
And optimization. Worry about that later. Get it working correctly first, then use profilers to find the real bottlenecks if speed is an issue. Don't guess where to optimize.
Get it right, then make it fast. Sound advice.
Also, try to use the highest level language possible for the job. Python, R, MATLAB, whatever makes you productive and the code readable. Only drop down to C++ or Fortran if you absolutely need the performance.
Maximize clarity first.
And finally, document the why, not just the how. Explain the design choices, the purpose of different modules, not just what each line of code mechanically does.
These all sound like solid software engineering principles, really.
They are. And the sources point out that while scientific software is vital, the developers often don't have formal CS backgrounds. So applying these software engineering practices is extra important for quality, maintainability, reusability.
Bringing that engineering discipline into the scientific domain, are these practices catching on?
Some more than others. A review found that scientists are focusing on things that boost productivity, code reuse, good programming techniques. That's positive.
Okay.
And tools like version control, Git, basically, and issue trackers are becoming pretty common, which is great for collaboration and managing complexity.
Good baseline practices.
But things like formal verification, validation, systematic testing, they're seen as important, but maybe not as widely adopted yet, perhaps due to time pressures or lack of training.
An area for improvement, then.
Definitely. And the review also noted a lack of clear evidence on the trade-offs, like how much time spent on testing saves you time later in debugging. That kind of analysis is still needed for the scientific context.
Interesting. So looking ahead, where is NLP 4P going? What's next?
Well, it's moving fast. Continued deep learning advances are key. Research is likely to dig into even more fine-grained details of code structure and dependencies.
Getting even better at understanding the nuances.
Hopefully. And a big challenge is handling non-functional requirements. It's one thing to generate code that works, but what about code that's also secure, efficient, usable, maintainable? That's much harder.
Right, these abilities.
Exactly. And this idea of compositional generalization is important too. Can models learn basic programming building blocks and then combine them in new, creative ways to solve complex problems they haven't seen before?
Like learning words and grammar, then writing new sentences.
Kind of, yeah. It's crucial for tackling really novel and complex coding tasks.
Wow. We've covered a lot of ground, from the basics of structure and function to AI writing code from papers and the challenges of scientific software. If you had to boil it down, what are the main takeaways for our listener from this deep dive?
I'd say the biggest thing is realizing how deeply NLP is becoming intertwined with programming. It's using the properties of code structure, function, to automate or assist with a huge range of tasks.
Understanding, searching, generating, translating, refining.
Exactly. And large language models, the transformers, are really accelerating this. They're enabling things like paper-to-code, which could genuinely change how research and development happen. So you should have a much clearer picture now of how AI is learning the language of code.
Okay, that sets us up nicely for our final thought for you today. As AI gets better and better at the mechanics of coding, understanding, generating, debugging, what happens to the role of the human programmer or researcher?
Yeah, it's a fascinating question. Do we shift more towards high-level design, problem definition, oversight, letting the AI handle more of the detailed implementation?
Or does it free us up for different kinds of creativity? The possibilities are definitely worth thinking about.
Absolutely. And this deep dive, it's really just scratching the surface. We definitely encourage you to check out some of the resources, maybe play with tools like Copilot if you haven't already, and consider how this might affect your own field or interests.
What research problems or coding headaches would you most like to see AI tackle next? Something to ponder. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.
Hope you found it insightful.
Until next time.